movie review. Today's movie I'm going to be reviewing is the 1992 action movie Under Siege, starring Steven Seagal and directed by Andrew Davis. Yeah, that movie. And I own this in like a 4-movie collection I got for Christmas a few years ago. And when it comes to Steven Seagal, I like his earlier movies from the 80s to the 90s. And I do like the 2001 movie Exit Wounds. However, I have avoided most of his direct-to-video movies because I heard that most of his direct-to-video movies are pretty bad. I actually have seen one of his direct-to-video movies called Attack Force from 2006, and Attack Force is an absolute terrible movie, and that is easily Steven Seagal's worst movies of the ones I've seen. But that's a whole nother video, whole nother topic, whole nother day. But anyways, let's get on with this review. So, this movie's got a pretty stacked cast. You got Steven Seagal as the main character, Casey Ryback. You got Erika Elenake as Jordan Tate. You got Patrick O'Neal as Captain Adams. You got Gary Busey as Peter Krill. And, of course, Tommy Lee Jones as William Stranix. So, what is the plot of this movie? Well, the plot is as follows. A U.S. battleship is on its way to be decommissioned, is the target for a ruthless gang of terrorists. Fortunately, there's a hero, and he's the cook. So that's basically the premise of the movie. And how was this movie made? Well, in 1988, Andrew Davis, who directed Code of Silence, 1985, starring Chuck Norris, which was a big hit, he directed an action movie for Warner Bros. In 1988 called Above the Law, starring Steven Seagal in his first film role. Despite the movie getting a mixed reception from critics, it was a huge success at the box office, making $18.8 million worldwide on a $7.5 million budget. And director Andrew Davis and actor Steven Seagal enjoyed working together. In the summer of 1991, it was announced Andrew Davis and Steven Seagal would be making another movie together called Under Siege. Production began on March 2nd, 1992, and it ended on May 12, 1992. When the movie was released on October 8th, 1992, it received positive reviews from critics and audiences, making $156.5 million worldwide on a $35 million budget, making it Steven Seagal's most successful movie and the first movie of his to receive positive reviews from both critics and audiences, because until this movie had come out, even though his previous movies before this were big hits at the box office, they received mixed to negative reviews from critics, but this was the first official Steven Seagal movie that actually did receive positive reviews from both critics and audiences, and well-deserved so. As for my critics praised the movie for, the performances by, of course, Steven Seagal as the lead and Tommy Lee Jones as the villain. And because of the success of this movie, movie director Andrew Davis, he went on to direct The Fugitive from 1993, starring Harrison Ford and Tommy Lee Jones, which was also a critically acclaimed film. That is one of my favorite action movies. As for my reaction to this movie, Under Siege is an awesome movie and easily one of the best action movies of the 1990s. So the movie starts off in the Pacific Ocean, where we see a large U.S. battleship, and we are introduced to our main character of the movie, Casey Ryback, played by Steven Seagal, who is the cook of the ship, and he is visited to and spoken by a man. And the man basically says to him, "Hey, Case, what's happening? Where's your white uniform? Where's your white? Where's your white uniform? The president is coming. White hat. The president is coming." And then Casey says, "He won't miss me." And then the man says, "Hey, what is this? What is this, man? You're in the Navy, man. You have to look good." He then hands Casey his hat, and then Casey thanks him. And one thing I will say about this movie is that it is a very well-directed movie when it comes to the outside scenery, like when the ship is moving and a dolphin jumps out of the water briefly. And this movie actually did win an Oscar. If I'm not mistaken, I think this movie did win an Oscar for Best Special Effects and Best Sound Design, and I think maybe Best Cinematography. I don't remember if it won that category, but I mean, that's impressive. Not many action movies get awards like that. And 2 minutes into the movie, we're introduced to Peter Krill, played by Gary Busey, who, based on his uniform, looks like he works with the Navy. However, he plays a major role in this movie, which I'll get to later. And 2 minutes into the movie, 2 minutes and 5 seconds into the movie, Captain Adams, played by Patrick O'Neill, tells Casey Ryback to get into his uniform, and then Casey says, "You know how I feel about ceremonies. I thought this time," and then he is interrupted by Captain Adams, who says, if I had your ribbon, I would wear it to bed." And then Casey says, "Yes, sir." And then Captain Adams then says, "Now get in your white uniform." And then the captain says, "I'll see if I can get you an intern with the president." And then Casey says, "I appreciate that, but I have a lot going on." And then Peter Krill, played by Gary Busey, chimes in and he says, "I don't think that's a very good idea, sir." And then Casey says, "For once, Krill and I are in total agreement, sir. By the way, I have 50 gallons of food that I need to prepare by tomorrow." And then Captain Adams says, "My birthday." And then Casey says, "Yes, sir. I could do the cheeseburger routine." And then Captain Adams says, No. It's not for me. It's for the crew. They really love that stuff. So we'll do that." And then he says, "All right, just don't show your face up until after the ceremony." And Casey says, "Yes, sir." And then Captain Adams says, "You're a sorry-looking sailor." And then Casey says, "Yes, I am." Again, good stuff. And I gotta say, I love the scene when Casey leaves the captain's office and Peter Krill says, "Sir, why do you tolerate that clown? I know you think he's a good cook, a good cook." And then Captain Adams says, "He's more than a good cook. You have no idea. Now I have to let him be XO." We then cut to a ceremony, and while this is going on, Casey Ryback is cooking food and talking with some of his friends. And then Casey Ryback, played by Steven Seagal, is actually likable in this movie, you know? And I love the scene when Casey says, "Ramirez, where's your tattoo?" And then I love the scene where Ramirez says, "Man, where I have it, you don't want to see it," which I thought was a funny joke. And then Casey says, "Did y'all ever hear the joke about when Andre and Bedrew went hunting on the bayou? Where are the guns? Yeah, where are the guns, Drewette?" And then him and his friends start laughing. And then one of Casey's friends says, "That's about right." We then cut to a scene with President Bush continuing on a speech, and he says, "And in the end of unity, in the end of this unity of purpose, these ceremonies not only remember war, they celebrate peace." And then a TV executive says, "The president recently ordered the removal of all nuclear Tomahawk cruise missiles from U.S. surface ships. Tomorrow, the battleship embarks for San Francisco for her final voyage. Her awesome weaponry will be dismantled and removed, probably to never be fired again. Then decommissioned Missouri will take her place in naval history." And 6 minutes and 24 seconds into the movie, we cut back to Krill, who says, "Lieutenant Ballard, we haven't got time to be talking about this right now." The lieutenant then questions, "No time to be talking about the security of nuclear weapons?" And then Peter Krill says, "Maybe I'm not making myself clear. Any watches not absolutely crucial shall be during the party. That includes the Marine roving patrol." You just get the sense, and what I gotta say is, you just get the sense that something is off about Peter. Like, you have a feeling that he's up to something, but which we will get to. And I love the scene 7 minutes into the movie where Casey says to Cue Ball, one of his friends, "Show me your moves, Cue Ball." And then a friend and Cue Ball start dancing. And you definitely buy Steven Seagal's character, Casey Ryback, as a person who cares for his friends in this movie, which I really like. I love the part when Taylor turns off the boombox and he talks to Casey Ryback, and Taylor says, "Sir." And then Casey says, "You don't have to sir me, Taylor. We're casual down here in the alley, you know." And then Taylor says, "I'd watch it, Ryback. We still have a week together." And then I love the scene where Casey Ryback insults Taylor by saying, I guess that means I won't get to see you go through puberty." And then all of his friends start to laugh. Like, That was a very funny scene. And then Taylor says, I have orders from XO on the captain's birthday. We're having dinner flown in from Hawaii. This galley will be cleared by 1700, and you and your crew are to assemble at the mess deck prior to Hello's arrival. And then Casey then says negative. And then Taylor says, excuse me. And then Casey says, I'm the only one who cooks on this ship for the captain. You don't like it, you go talk to him. And then Taylor says, I don't think you understand. We're planning a surprise party for the captain, and no one is going to talk to the captain about this. Casey then says, you know something, Taylor? The captain don't like surprises, and neither do I. Taylor then says, well, I guess we'll see then. And then he leaves. And then Casey Ryback, played by Steven Seagal, like, he is absolutely hilarious in this movie. Like, some of his one-liners. And Krill informs the captain about the surprise party, and the captain agrees to keep it a secret. And 10 minutes into the movie, we are introduced to William Stranix, briefly, played by Tommy Lee Jones, who's in a helicopter with other men and women, and William Stranix is the main villain of the movie. And Peter Krill walks in telling everyone to get out as they have orders, and Peter Krill, and everyone in the room except for Casey Ryback, Peter Krill, and a few federal workers basically, lecture him, and Peter spits into the pot of food Casey was working on, and he says, I added that for a little flavor. The captain won't be here to save you this time. And then, Casey, and I do not blame, Casey Ryback for this, because if I worked hard on a food and then someone just, decided to spit in a pan, I'd be upset. Basically, Casey Ryback shoves Peter saying, you're crazy and stuff like that. And then Casey says, and then one of the men yells, that's striking an officer. And then Casey yells, oh, come on, that's not striking an officer. And then he punches another officer in the face and he says, now that's striking an officer. I'm like, okay. And then we get an action scene where Casey fights 4 other officers before he stopped, and Taylor says, throw him in the brig. And then Casey then calls out Taylor for breaking the rules by saying, nobody goes in the brig without the old man's signature. And then Peter Krill says, good point. Secure him in the meat locker. Then he locks the door with a screwdriver after shoving Casey in there. And Peter Krill then orders Private Nash to make sure Casey doesn't escape, and tells him no one lets him out and no one speaks to him. And he basically orders him to basically shoot Casey Ryback directly in the forehead by the brain if he escapes. And 13 minutes into the movie, we cut to William Stranix on the helicopter on its way to the ship, and William Stranix, played by Tommy Lee Jones, he says, well, I think it speaks very well for the U.S. Navy that we are allowed to entertain a ship's crew at sea, don't you? And then Jordan Tate says, I just hope I don't throw up. And then William Stranix laughs and says, you'll be fine. And William and his crew land on the ship. And I really like the villain, William Stranix, played by Tommy Lee Jones. As you can tell, he's having fun with the role, and you don't get to see Tommy Lee Jones play a villain too often. And Jordan Tate meets Peter Krill and seems to like him at first, which is right after William arrived, and Peter tells him to go to the starboard side, a certain section of the ship. Before Jordan Tate is about to head through the door, William says, hey, don't worry about a thing, baby. You play this gig with your eyes closed. And then we cut to a scene with Casey yelling private, where Casey Ryback yelling, private, let me out of here. And I love the build-up to this movie when William Stranix arrives, and now we as the audience know he's the villain, but like nobody else knows that. I love the scene where he arrives at the party, he's having fun with everyone. No one suspects anything, and everyone thinks he's just a normal guy who came for fun, as he even hosts a guest party. But then 21 minutes and 13 seconds into the movie, William Stranix shoots Commander Green dead, freaking everyone out. And then we find out Peter Krill, played by Gary Busey, is actually in on the whole operation, which I thought was a good twist. I mean, we as the audience, we knew something was off about him, but I didn't expect that when I first saw that movie. I was like, all right, not bad. And then there's the scene where Peter Krill, played by Gary Busey, shoots Captain Adams, killing him, and then William Stranix and all his terrorist buddies take over the ship. And I like the part when Casey says, "I hear gunfire, what's going on?" And I really like the action scenes in this movie, especially the shootout scenes. And then there's the whole scene where William and Peter point guns at people, telling them to get out of the room, and basically they're in a submarine that's basically attached to the boat, and they basically tell them to get out of the room, and William makes somebody seal all escape routes, shutting, making the ship under siege, and trapping the crews in certain sections of the ship as they, well, basically William Stranix, he leaves the submarine that's still attached to the ship, but certain people go down with it. But yeah. And one thing I will say about the movie too is that so we cut to a scene where Casey demands for the guy guarding the door to check in with Peter Krill on the phone to see if everything's okay. So he does, and Peter Krill answers the phone, assuring Private Nash that everything is okay, and he's been with the captain, and that someone is coming to relieve him. And Nash, rightfully so, he basically questions him, asking if everything's all right, as he heard sounds that sound like gunfire upstairs. And then Peter says, "Those are party poppers and firecrackers, a part of the captain's party. You just stand firm until you are relieved." And then Nash agrees and hangs up the phone. And Peter Krill tells William about Casey Ryback, and William says, "My men are professionals. They can deal with anything. Over 20 Navy SEALs and 100 cooks." However, William Stranix underestimates how strong and how deadly Casey Ryback can be, and he finds out that he's not a force to be messed with. And there's even the scene where Casey Ryback tells Nash, "Those are not party poppers. They are gunshots. Use your head and think for once. Something is not right." And two of William's men go up to Nash, pointing a gun, demanding he put his hands on his head and down on his knees, and they basically ask where the cook is, and after Nash gives the correct answer, they shoot him. And I like the scene where Casey is hiding in an air vent, and then he slams it on one of the bad guys' heads, and then he locks them in the room with a screwdriver, which is what happened to Casey Ryback earlier. And then Casey shuts off the power grid, and just before the guards escape, he's hiding in the dark, and then Steven Seagal's character, Casey Ryback, picks up a knife, throwing it at a guard's neck, and then chokes out the other guard. And Casey Ryback finds the dead body of Captain Adams, and he basically is upset that the captain's dead, rightfully so, as he was close with him, and he plans to avenge the captain and get revenge on the people responsible, which I like that story arc for him. And U.S. military officers receive a call by William Stranix that says, "Hear this, gentlemen. If any ships or aircraft come within 100 miles, we kill the crew and retaliate with everything in the ship's arsenal." And then the admiral asks William, "Why are you doing this?" And we find out that the reason William Stranix is doing this, the bad guy played by Tommy Lee Jones, is because he wants to steal its nuclear Tomahawk missiles and sell them in the black market for profit. And his objective is to trigger global chaos and get revenge against his former employees who previously tried to assassinate him after canceling one of his operations, which that's a really good villain motive. 43 minutes into the movie, Casey Ryback meets Jordan Tate, who is William's female partner, and Casey points a gun at her and he puts it down, basically asking her questions, and basically Jordan Tate says, "I was hired to jump out of the cake, but I got, because she was in like a cake, well, a fake, like a giant cake that she was meant to jump out of as like a surprise for the captain." But she says, "I was hired to jump out of the cake, but I guess I got really airsick on the way over, and this guy gave me pills, and I don't know what's happening. I don't know what happened. I guess I fell asleep." And Casey doesn't believe what she's saying, and then Jordan says, "I'm an actress, okay?" And then Casey asks, "How many people were in that chopper?" And Jordan says, "I don't know, but it was full. And there was a lot of caretakers. You have to believe me. I don't know anything." And then Casey Ryback says, "All right, I believe you." And then Jordan asks, "Who are you, a special forces agent?" And then I like the part when when Casey's like, nah, I'm just a cook. And then Casey and Jordan agree to team up to survive. And I love the scene where Peter Krill, played by Gary Busey, and William Stranix, played by Tommy Lee Jones, turn on the breaker box, and they duck for cover when they realize there's a bomb about to go off in the microwave. And then William demands his men to take down Casey Ryback. And Casey Ryback contacts Admiral Bates in a quiet, abandoned room, and Bates basically wants Casey to feed them on-site intel. And Casey agrees, and he tells them he's hanging up He's hanging up before the terrorists pick up the signal, and they just want Casey to contact them again in 30 minutes. And Casey also informs them that Peter Krill is in on the terrorist operation, which shocks the Admiral. And Casey tells Jordan to hide, and she and him both have guns. And this is a little later, like a little past the 50-minute mark, around the 55-ish minute mark, but they both have guns armed on them. And when no one is looking, Casey puts lighter fluid on the helicopter, and Casey is spotted, and he jumps off the boat into the water as the helicopter behind him explodes. He then climbs back on the ship when no one is looking. Jordan Tate has been taken hostage. Then Casey Ryback gets back on the ship and shoots 3 men dead all at once. And then him and Jordan go behind a door, sealing it shut, and Steven Seagal pulls the pin on a grenade, placing it behind the steel door. When more of William's bad guys go up to the door, it explodes because a grenade was put there. And I really like that scene. And Peter Krill shows William Stranix that there's a button to flood a room of water, and is basically planning to drown some of the crew in it. And Casey Ryback breaks down a door and reunites with a few of his friends. Casey sees that on a TV that William is flooding a room with the crew, and Casey and all of his friends basically agreed to team up, save the people, defeat the bad guys, and escape the ship. I mean, a good enough motive. And I gotta say, the entire movie is great, but especially the last 40 minutes of this movie are just an absolute blast. And SEAL Team 5 helicopters are on their way to rescue Casey Ryback and everyone else. And I gotta say, I love the scene where the submarine that detached itself earlier in the film, which is now on the water's surface with many bad guys on it. I like that part when Casey Ryback is in a scuba suit shooting at the bad guys, and then he sets bombs on the side of it, making them going off. Again, good stuff. And I like the scene where I even like the scene where Jordan saves Casey from death as well. And I love the scene where William launches 2 missiles towards Honolulu, and he basically sings the Star Spangled Banner. You know, and again, you can just tell that Tommy Lee Jones is having a blast playing the villain. And I love the showdown between Casey Ryback and William Stranix, where after a very brutal fight where they are both fighting with knives, they are really going at it with each other. Like, they're they're stabbing each other with knives a little bit, but they're also they also duck, and they get some cuts on them, but they're in a pretty brutal fight. And then Casey Ryback slams William's head through a glass monitor screen, resulting not only in William's death, but it also stops 2 of the missiles, and then the final missile is destroyed. And the aircraft is called off by the lieutenant, and the movie ends on a happy note with all the hostages on the ship saved, as well as America. The movie then ends with Casey Ryback and everyone else putting their hands sideways on their heads to honor the captain, the captain who died. So yeah, at the end of the day, this is a pretty good action movie. I would recommend this if you've never seen it, especially if, you've never seen a Steven Seagal movie and you want to get into his movies. This would definitely not be a bad one to start with. And now Steven Seagal, he's not one of the top tier action stars. I do think there are better martial arts movie stars. I prefer Chuck Norris. I prefer Jean-Claude Van Damme, I prefer Bruce Lee, but I will admit Steven Seagal did make a couple of good movies, and this is definitely one of them. So yeah, On a scale of 1 to 10, I am going to give Under Siege a 9 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, that was my review on Under Siege. I want to hear from you guys in the comment section down below. What do you think of this? And what's your favorite Steven Seagal movie? That would be an interesting conversation. But anyways, guys, we'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye now.